Hey there, welcome to this edition of Learning with Human Kinetics. My name is Aaron, and today I'm going to talk about overtraining. Now, in the title and leading up to this episode, I asked the question, are you overtraining? For some people, the easy answer might be no, while others, there might be some gray area or confusion on where some of you stand. So I hope to answer some of those questions for you today. Now, to get started, we need to first talk about the goal of training. Now, everyone has their own specific and targeted goals. Whether that's for strength, hypertrophy, power, speed, or any other number of individual goals that you might have. But for the overall goal of training in the general sense is to provide an overload stimulus to the body so that physiological adaptations can happen and improve overall performance. Now, Corey and I did a recent trainer talk on progressive overload to explain what that is and the proper ways to do it. That's available on our YouTube, so if you want to get some good insight on overload, I encourage you to check that out on our Human Kinetics YouTube channel. So essentially, when we're training, again, depending on your specific goals, you're providing stress to your body. Now that stimulus can come from training frequency, training volume, or training intensity. So as we discussed in the trainer talk, intensity can be a change in resistance or the amount of weight that you're using. Or you can do things like reduce the rest time between sets or rounds of circuits or increase RPE. These are all great ways to adapt your training and to make sure that you don't plateau. If the goal is to add new stress to your body and continue to progress through your workouts, you have to add some sort of variable to your training plan. The issue comes when you add too much stress to your body over a long period of time without giving your body an adequate amount of rest. Without enough recovery, you could eventually fall into overtraining syndrome. This is when the accumulation of stress becomes so severe that you begin to see long-term decrements in performance. Now, when this happens, you've already gone too far. It could take several weeks to months to fully recover and return to what you would consider your baseline. Now, by definition, overtraining syndrome is a prolonged maladaptation not only of the athlete, but of a number of biological, neurochemical, and hormonal regulation mechanisms. This is the same condition that some people refer to as burnout or chronic overwork, staleness in your workouts, unexplained underperformance, or overfatigue. Like I said, when you get to this point, the symptoms or consequences can last as long as 6 months or more, and in the worst case scenario, it could actually end an athletic career. Now, overtraining can sometimes be confused with overreaching, so I want to make that clear right here. When an athlete has an excessive training load that leads to short-term decrements in performance, this is called overreaching. Now, the main difference, overreaching is short-term, whereas overtraining is long-term. Now, the short-term overreaching is sometimes called or referred to as functional overreaching. Recovery from this type of decrement is usually possible with a few days or weeks of rest. Some programs actually call for overreaching, if you can imagine that. Now, this is where an athlete intentionally overworks themselves to build up a level of tolerance and then tapers to allow for a super compensation in performance. Short-term overreaching, when done correctly, is followed by a tapering period. And in the end, the athlete can benefit from gaining strength or power. But when it's mismanaged, that's when it can lead to negative effects. Now, when the intensity of training continues without a taper or a deload period, and the person doesn't get enough recovery, the functional overreaching turns into non-functional overreaching. Now, non-functional overreaching in turn leads to a sort of staleness or stagnation and a decrease in performance. And if it's bad enough, it can go on for several weeks or months. This is why it's important to have balance between training and recovery. The first signs of this extended training stress are decrease in performance, increased fatigue, and sometimes hormonal disturbances. So a quick recap to explain the order of how this might happen. Say an athlete can train with overload built into their training program. If adequate rest isn't included, there might be acute fatigue or immediate fatigue that could last a few days. This means you might have altered neuron function, but some athletes might not see any effect at all. Now, following that acute fatigue, assuming there still isn't any rest and recovery, the fatigue would lead to functional overreaching. Now, functional overreaching will last, like I said, from a few days to a couple of weeks. There will be a temporary decrease in performance, but then the athlete will most likely return to their baseline. If there's still no rest and the athlete continues to push through the fatigue, he or she then approaches non-functional overreaching, which lasts a few weeks to months. What does non-functional overreaching look like? You might see a decrease in performance, decrease in motor coordination, decreased muscle glycogen, increased resting heart rate and blood pressure, altered immune function, altered hormonal concentrations, and mood disturbances. The hope is that at some point the athlete will take a step back from training and competition, get some rest, and eventually return to their baseline, but we know this doesn't always happen. So if it doesn't, this is where overtraining syndrome kicks in. Now, overtraining syndrome can last months at a time. Like the previous stages, you'll see a decrease in performance, decreased force production from skeletal muscle, which means a decrease in power, decreased glycolytic capacity, emotional and sleep disturbances, and it could ultimately lead to sickness and infection. Now, the irony is that training is supposed to be a healthy outlet and a form of stress relief for some people, and a way to improve yourself. But as you can see, if it isn't done properly and rest time isn't included in your overall plan, it could have the opposite effect. So, is any of this sounding familiar yet to anyone? I really hope it's not, but whether you're a busy professional dealing with stress from all angles, or an athlete that trains and competes year-round, it's pretty likely that either yourself or someone you know has experienced overtraining at some point. Passion and motivation are great, I'll say that, but if they turn to obsession with no downtime, the good intentions could lead to struggles and setbacks. Now, a predominant feature of overtraining syndrome is the inability to sustain high-intensity exercise when the training load is increased. Now, think about some of those symptoms I just mentioned that come with overtraining syndrome. Decreased force production, decreased performance, decreased glycolytic capacity, sleep disturbances. In addition to the muscular fatigue that comes with overtraining, if sleep quality is going down at night, the lack of sleep would make it pretty tough to get in a good high-intensity workout the next day. And now a big question is, why does this happen? A common mistake is that the rate of progressive overload is too high. Now, whether that's an error in programming or an overly ambitious athlete who doesn't want to take a break, the volume or intensity of training increases too rapidly, and over a period of a few weeks to a few months without much recovery, that's when this will happen. So I've seen this in athletes who have great intentions, but aren't necessarily being realistic about their training progress. Now, for example, say an athlete comes in to train 3 days per week, we'll give the strength coach the benefit of the doubt that he or she is programming correctly. Now, during the off days for the athletes, however, the athlete might go into the gym to get in their own workout. Now, as you can imagine, soon the athlete's training 6 to 7 days per week and doubling up on muscle groups in addition to practice and games. It's easy to see how, even with good intentions, some people might fall into the trap of overtraining. Now, from that perspective, it's a good idea to have everyone involved in the programming, or at least the scheduling process. That means, the strength coach, the sport coach, and anyone else that might be impacting the day-to-day schedule of the athlete. The majority of the research on overtraining has been done on endurance athletes. So think of a distance runner who runs 6 to 7 days a week in addition to strength training. It'd be understandable that at times someone in that situation would at some point suffer from overtraining, or at least that non-functional overreaching. On the other hand, it's also been reported that 77% of athletes who experience overtraining are also involved in sports that require high level of strength or speed training. So this would be more toward your sports like basketball or football, or maybe even tennis, for example. Some of the markers of aerobic overtraining that you might see might be, like I said, decrease in performance, decrease in percentage of body fat, decrease in maximal oxygen uptake, altered blood pressure, increased muscle soreness, decreased muscle glycogen, altered resting heart rate, altered cortisol concentration, decreased testosterone concentration, decreased ratio of total testosterone to cortisol, and mood changes. As for anaerobic training, things to look for are unexplained underperformance, persistent fatigue, increased sense of effort during training. So maybe the performance is declining, but the athlete feels that they have to work, twice as hard to do what they would consider average work. Also look for abnormal sleep patterns and loss of appetite. Anaerobic overtraining also sees mood changes, anemia, and increased injuries. Now, to be clear, just because an athlete is experiencing one of those symptoms doesn't necessarily mean that he or she is overtraining. And that's why constantly monitoring the athlete's behavior in terms of training, performance, mood, injury rate, all of those factors and tendencies is important to see exactly what is changing in the athlete's life. Now, the American College of Sports Medicine and the European College of Sports Medicine got together and released a statement to kind of explain overtraining, and said that overtraining is considered a process stemming from functional overreaching in the short term and in more extreme cases of non-functional overtraining. Now, both cases result in performance decrements, which is the basis for overtraining. Now, in the case of functional overreaching, intensity of training is intentionally increased, causing a brief decrement in performance, like I mentioned. Now, this is all planned out and follows with a few days or weeks of recovery. This is ultimately intended to increase performance following a break in training, but as I mentioned earlier, non-functional overreaching becomes an issue when the break following functional overreaching doesn't happen. So in other words, there's no break or downtime for the athlete, and performance suffers so much that it'll take months of recovery in order for the athlete to return what is considered baseline. If the athlete still doesn't take time for recovery, that's when full-blown overtraining syndrome kicks in, and at that point, it's too late for some athletes. At this point, training volume is so unusually high that creatine kinase levels increase, which is a sign of muscle damage. And like I mentioned, muscle glycogen actually decreases with prolonged overtraining, contributing to lower lactate responses. But sometimes the decreased muscle glycogen can be from a poor diet. So nutrition is definitely a factor that you want to keep in mind, especially when you're trying to track those tendencies. Now, when looking at overtraining syndrome, keep in mind that this is a culmination of stressors in the person's life. The primary cause will be an increase in intensity in training without adequate recovery, but also keep in mind total stress on the body, like lack of sleep, stress from school or work, excessive travel, which might be because of the sports schedule. Keeping all of this under control is crucial in preventing overtraining syndrome, along with keeping up with good nutrition habits. A well-designed training program will help minimize the effects of overreaching or overtraining, because the intensity and volume will be varied, and the athlete will see some relief from the constant increases that lead to overreaching or overtraining. If you're monitoring your training and all the symptoms of overreaching and overtraining, you'll be in a much better position to catch one of the markers that I mentioned. And if that happens, simply make adjustments to your training program or the overall schedule to build more rest and recovery time into that schedule. Now, we talked a little bit about some of this in the author talk episode with Pete McCall that I had recently, which you can find on YouTube. He has a book out now called Smarter Recovery, where he lays out the importance of rest and recovery. In the interview, we talked about how even for non-competitive athletes, it's possible to overtrain in the sense that your body might already be stressed from work. If your body is stressed, it doesn't care where the stress is coming from, so you always have to take that into account. Now, I've seen this in general population clients who have a super stressful work environment. If they're having a stressful season of work, the last thing they want to do, or maybe I should say the worst thing for their body in that case, would be to train at a ridiculously high intensity for an extended period of time, because that's only going to add to the stress on their body. Instead, they might need days where training isn't as intense and almost use their workouts as a stress relief as opposed to adding more stress. The same is the case for athletes. Now, unfortunately, if an athlete's having a really tough semester in school, or maybe they're stressed because of something going on in their family, something that's going to stress them out for an extended period of time, they're probably going to feel like they're underperforming in their sport and in their workouts. Their workouts might not be very good at this point. So instead of kicking up the intensity for months at a time, they might need the opposite. They might need to back off a little bit. So it's important to train hard and stay consistent in your training. Like I said, whether you're a competitive athlete or if your playing days are over and you're working toward other goals, but always consider your stress levels and the total amount of stress you're putting on your body. You're training for a reason. It might be for sports performance or fat loss or strength gains, but regardless of what it is, you have to be smart about it. Don't overcomplicate the process. But in the same respect, recovery should be part of the training plan. It shouldn't be something that happens every now and then. Build it into your overall plan, and you'll be in much better position to prevent overtraining and any setbacks that come with it. So I mentioned a few resources that you can check out that touch on some of the topics I talked about today, like our Trainer Talk episode on progressive overload. Make sure to listen to Pete McCall's interview on recovery and the importance of building fitness into your lifestyle. And there's also a Learning with Human Kinetics on periodization. So if you're watching this and you aren't familiar with how to periodize your workouts, I would definitely recommend looking into that, because that's an excellent way to add variation into your training and to prevent overtraining. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel and hit the bell to get alerts. You can also keep up with additional information on topics like this by subscribing to our email newsletters, and make sure to follow us on all of our various social media platforms, Instagram, Facebook, X, and TikTok. So if you have follow-up questions or have topics you'd like to hear more about, please let us know. The purpose of these discussions is to create conversation and to help you learn how to live stronger, healthier lives, and to help other people do the same. So please reach out, give us your feedback, give us topics that you want to hear more about, and we will do our best to get that information out to you. So thanks again for listening today, and until next time, be well.